Hello, everybody. We are live. Sorry for the late response. I was messing around with my Apple Watch because it wasn't functioning right. Anyhow, last we left off, we were exploring these undergrounds. We had just reached some new checkpoints, and we're gonna just keep it going. Oh yeah, and we just gotten a Tunic of Winds, which I think made two, didn't it? Yep. So I might sell one of those. There's been so much debate, by the way, on like timeline placement. Well, I'll wait till he hops in if he does, and then I'll go into it. Since I was talking Zelda theory earlier. But, well, I can at least touch on it now for YouTube's sake. There's been some debate on where the placement for this game would be on the timeline. I think it's generally accepted, via Zelda timeline at least, that it's generally, like the official Zelda timeline, that's officially, like, that's generally near the bottom, like the end. Like, it's much later, so much time later that, all previous events are regarded as part of a era of myth. I see you just chilling right there. And on that note, though, the official Zelda timeline also has three actual timelines. Well, one's more of a what-if scenario, but you know, three timelines. Let me just be note that I'm using that word loosely. It's really two timelines and again a what if story. Um, and I think it was Game Theory, Matt Pat, is where I had originally heard this theory that I quite like. But Hyrule Warriors, which is non-canon, but based on its story, it takes place after most of the other Zelda games, uh, due to the nature of what it is. It has to. Um, so I've heard it put that what is going on is that Hyrule Warriors is a convergence point for the Zelda timeline. Essentially, it's a point where nature of events brings different timelines together, which main game is it 100% the truth? Because in the main game, we only see Ocarina, Skyward, and Twilight Princess, I think. Ocarina and Skyward are before the split. Well, I'm trying to remember what the Ocarina references were. Because if they reference Link as being like the hero of time, then that actually does reference a second timeline. Right? Yeah. The adult timeline. Because Twilight Princess is from the child timeline. Which is to say, at the end of Ocarina, Link was sent back in time by Zelda to, like, live out his childhood. And the effect that would have is that it meant that the adult timeline is a timeline in which, it existed, it was, a thing, but that, it had to continue on without the hero. Another common theory is that it continued on without like the soul of the hero at all, because that entire soul got moved to the other timeline. So no reincarnation, thus Wind Waker. You know, he wasn't around to reincarnate, so instead the gods flooded the world to compensate for the lack of a hero. Which, on its own, that's a pretty interesting theory. But that, by referencing what it does, because especially counting Hyrule Warriors DLC, that ties in, like, a lot more. Like, Wind Waker, for example, gets drawn in there, which is 100% adult timeline. Whereas, like, Majora and Twilight Princess are child timeline. But yeah, the theory is that by drawing them together, it kind of fucked the Zelda timeline back into one singular line where different parts of the canons, histories were able to overlap. So, like, we could have a world that was once flooded by the Great Sea from Wind Waker without it necessarily having to be from the same timeline as Wind Waker. Because, like, just different elements from different parts, different timelines kind of overlap into making one. And it's not necessarily the most stable, like, scientifically theory that could be created, but it's a fun one regardless, and it's also interesting to me that it also manages to explain, not so much explain, I guess, but like, if you then consult that as being like the latest point in the timeline before this point, you know, the end of that era, then that would mean you could also explain away, you know, the very next game time-wise would, and this gets a little complicated due to time travel being in the game, but would be freaking Age of Calamity, which is the other Hyrule Warriors game. Effectively, Hyrule Warriors 2. So that being the next one, like, it sort of maths out, you know? Like, it makes sense. And, like, I acknowledge, for example, that it makes plenty of sense. And I especially like it when you consider Age of Calamity being a Hyrule Warriors game. Because I think that really drives the point home. So, when you account for all of that, you know, we get a game that is cohesively a point in which timelines could be merged together into one cohesive story, and then melded into what becomes the world of Breath of the Wild, which feels in a lot of ways like an amalgam of past Zelda lore, and that would make perfect sense, you know? So as such, I really like the idea that this isn't on any timeline, but rather is on what becomes of the timelines through so much time play in the franchise, you know? Timelines just sort of become fucked and are forcibly put back together into a single entity. And that single entity gives rise to Age of Calamity, Breath of the Wild, which I'm also going to have to mention that Age of the Calamity isn't fully set before Breath of the Wild. It's sort of a contention point in that without Breath of the Wild, Age of Calamity wouldn't happen. Because Age of Calamity shows a branch timeline that comes from what was Breath of the Wild. But it's Breath of the Wild altering the future, or altering the past from before Breath of the Wild to create a new timeline. So that way it branches while still being arguably the same timeline. And I really like that theory, because that theory to me also pushes beyond doubt a way for the Zelda timeline as it was given to us to exist, other than the pseudo implication, which is that it was put together by a team of historians of Hyrule who were looking into their own past. And they did what they could with it. But, you know, there is data that could point to other possible ways for these events to have occurred or played out. Because if you run with that, it just puts things into too much of a zone of speculation, and, you know, speculation isn't satisfying to a personal headcanon. That's really what it comes out to. If speculation is required, then you're not going to be satisfied. Also, sorry for just rambling, but that just kind of been on my mind a little. Because I've recently seen Birdkeeper Toby's video on his headcanon for the Zelda timeline, which is on his second channel, his, you know, newish second channel. Might not even be second, it might be like multiple numbers, but it's the second one that I'm subscribed to. Which is Absurd Zelda Theories. To be fair, yeah, with a name like that, it makes sense that I would find a bit of grievance to file with it, but point is, it is a grounded enough theory, but to me personally, I want to trust the Zelda timeline as it came out. Thankfully, I wasn't one of the people who at least put too much time or energy into working on my own headcanon for a Zelda timeline before Hyrule Historia, so I don't take too much offense to the idea of them releasing a canon one. Yeah, no. At the end of the day, there are lots of points of contention that people bring up regarding the Zelda timeline. I'm not going to cite specific examples, partly because I don't trust myself to cite the specific examples, just off the top of my head, you know. But there are plenty of cases of contention where people aren't happy with one thing or the other. Like, you know, the Zora Rito thing in Wind Waker. But then, if that's the case, then why are they both alive both now in Breath of the Wild, but also in ancient past founding of Hyrule Breath of the Wild? Because theoretically, the founding of Hyrule should take place before most of the other games. At least any game that takes place in Hyrule or acknowledges Hyrule as being a thing that exists, you know? But, like, I don't like that argument. Or those arguments that a lot of people do make regarding it, because a lot of them I can mentally explain away as, I'm not going to say as gaps in our knowledge, but, you know, they could be explained if you either assume there are gaps in our knowledge or you just think about it in a little bit different of a manner. So, for example, one common thing that I hear that a lot of people treat DLC for Breath of the Wild as non-canon, right? But here's the thing to me. The DLC is treated as non-canon, then that's the only thing in a mainline Zelda game that we're treating as non-canon. Well, that may be like Street Pass stuff for the 3DS games, right? But why treat it as non-canon if instead we can't just make small logical leaps to canonize it in our own minds, you know? Because a lot of the times there are ways, at least, to make it make sense. There might not be, you know, the best ways, but the fact that they exist means I think they're at least worth exploring. As a concept, you know? What's that? Some sort of big Boko on a stall horse? That's what it looks like. Because I'd rather assume that maybe there are events we don't understand, there are events that sound similar by description. There definitely are events that sound similar by description. But, so, you know, that can cause people to misplace the idea of like, oh, it says this happened then, which means that this can't be true, but what if a description that we see maybe in-game of, you know, this thing happened in the past isn't necessarily describing the only time something that fits that description happened. You know? If we then think like that, then a lot of the things that cause people to hit with, oh, Zelda timeline invalid, Zelda timeline not real, all that crap, kind of be like written off as just being a misunderstanding less than a, you know, argument against fully. Oh, that's really disappointing. Okay. I see that. And I will take it for myself. I don't have weapons equipped. Okay, that's the light from a... Okay. But also, I feel like it's not something we should get so worked up about, you know? Which, if someone were to argue in a way that I disagree with enough, I know I would get just as heated as anyone else, but like, if the creators say, hey, this is how it happens, or, you know, at least if a more official source puts it out as, hey, here's a timeline, I get the appeal of trying to pick it apart, but like, why not spend all the effort explaining why sure it could work? And we all know that this franchise wasn't designed with the idea of one coherent timeline. It was just a series of fun adventures, and then we started making the timeline, and Nintendo had to be like, oh shit, let's try to give them an answer, because as everyone knows, not knowing is not satisfying. Oh, so I can't catch them on camera. That's interesting. It's very interesting. Anyway, after all, they only put that out, so those of us who don't like not knowing wouldn't have to deal with it. So I appreciate the effort that went into the official Zelda timeline, even if there are some logical loops that don't quite make sense. And I'd much rather put my energy into thinking about why I am okay with them and not how to tear them apart. Because I love this franchise and want to see it. I want to know that I have a thorough understanding of it. So I wouldn't be comfortable with the idea of a speculative timeline being my only potential headcanon. That's why I like the canon timeline. The only speculation that goes in there is Hyrule Warriors and Age of Calamity, and even then, they're non-canon games. If they weren't so good, I wouldn't care if they went in or not, but I enjoy them enough that I at least let them have their speculative spot. Unlike the CDI games. Fuck those. I would say it's a stain in the legacy, or on the legacy, but it's rather more like a mystic in it. Not that they wouldn't be something cool to own or potentially even stream, but like, who thought that would be a good idea? Not even just who at Nintendo, who at all. I don't even need that red pen, because I got it already. Hello, one viewer. You want to reveal who you are? Okay, pop up here. Says something alive right there. I don't think so. No, not right there. There. Okay. I guess if I can get enough of the area around it lit up, maybe it won't matter as much. Purple, red, and green, yellow, indigo-ish. There's like one more. And that would be orange. No. Red. Is it the straight blue one? Yeah, I think it's that last one. Which is over here. Okay, time for this excess stamina to come in use. Come in clutch. Okay. Moo Ufatar.